On a Friday in the autumn of 1187, the gates of Jerusalem swung open, and the city passed quietly out of Christian hands after 88 years. There was no massacre. There were no burning streets. No horses walking through blood in the courtyards of the temple. No bodies stacked against the walls. Instead, there were clerks with ledgers, sitting at tables near the gate, counting coins one by one as the citizens filed past to buy their freedom. 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who could not pay were meant to be taken as slaves, and yet thousands walked out anyway, released by the quiet order of the man who had taken the city. He was small, dark-bearded, softly spoken, and he wept easily. He suffered from stomach ailments and headaches, and he disliked hunting. He had come from a family of Kurdish soldiers of fortune who had once been driven out of their home in the middle of the night. He had not wanted Egypt when it was given to him, and he had not expected to rule anything at all. And yet by the time he stood outside the walls of Jerusalem, he commanded Cairo and Damascus and Aleppo, the Nile and the Orontes and the Euphrates, and every road between them. The chroniclers of his enemies, men whose fathers he had defeated and whose cities he had taken, wrote of him with a kind of baffled admiration that they granted to almost no one else. They called him courteous. They called him generous to the point of foolishness. Some of them, in the strange logic of the age, half wished he had been born a Christian so that they could love him without shame. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History remembers him by his honorific, Saladin, the righteousness of the faith, which the West softened into Saladin. He would die 6 years after taking Jerusalem in a rented house in Damascus, so poor that his household had to borrow money to pay for his burial. He had given everything else away. This is the story of how a reluctant young man from a family of exiles came to rule the heart of the medieval world, how he unmade one empire in Egypt and built another in its place, how he broke the kingdom of Jerusalem's in a single burning afternoon above the Sea of Galilee, and how the dynasty he founded outlived him by only 2 generations before it was swallowed by the slave soldiers he had trained. It is the story of the Ayyubids, of Egypt and the Holy War, and of a world where a man could be both feared and admired by the same people at the same time. So let the room go dark, settle in, breathe slowly, and let the desert wind come up over the sand. If you feel like it, leave a note below telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always like to imagine the map of everyone drifting off together. To understand how strange Saladin's rise was, you have to first understand how broken his world had become. In the middle of the 12th century, the lands between the Nile and the Tigris were not one civilization, but many, layered on top of one another like sediment, each still carrying the shape of some older order that had collapsed. 500 years earlier, there had been a single Muslim state stretching from Spain to the borders of India, ruled in theory from one capital, praying in one direction to one caliph. By the year 1150, that unity survived only in memory and in the wording of Friday sermons. What remained was a landscape of rival princes, competing caliphs, mercenary armies, walled cities that trusted no one beyond their own gates, and a strip of coastline held by armed pilgrims from the far side of the sea. In Baghdad sat the Abbasid Caliph, the heir of the Golden Age, the man whose name was still spoken in mosques from Central Asia to Morocco. He wore black, the color of his dynasty, and he lived in a palace of gardens and libraries beside the Tigris. But his power had been hollowed out generations before by Turkish soldiers who had come to serve him and stayed to command him. He could bless, he could legitimize, he could grant titles and robes of honor to warlords who had already taken what they wanted by force. He could no longer raise an army that anyone feared. In Cairo sat a second caliph, a rival caliph, the Fatimid, who claimed descent from the Prophet's daughter and who had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries. His court still glittered. The palaces of Cairo held storerooms of emeralds and rock crystal and carved ivory, libraries of hundreds of thousands of volumes, gardens with imported animals, and a ceremonial life of such elaborate slowness that ambassadors sometimes waited weeks to see a curtain drawn back on a silent boy in a jeweled turban. But behind the curtain there was almost nothing left. Real power in Egypt had passed to the office of the vizier, and the office of the vizier had become a prize fought over by soldiers. Viziers rose by murder and fell by murder. In a single generation, the position changed hands so often that the men who held it began keeping their palaces fortified against the city they governed. Between these 2 exhausted centers lay Syria, and Syria was in pieces. Damascus was ruled by one family, Aleppo by another, Mosul by a third, and each of them regarded the others as the primary threat. The Turkish and Kurdish commanders who held the smaller towns, the mountain castles, the river crossings, and the caravan roads changed masters as often as the seasons changed. A soldier might serve the lord of Aleppo in spring, take service in Damascus by autumn, and be besieging his former comrades by the following year. Nobody found this shocking. It was simply how the world worked. Loyalty ran to a person, not to a state, and persons died. Into this fractured landscape at the very end of the 11th century had come the Franks. That was the word used for them across the Muslim East. Frange, a catch-all for the armed Westerners who arrived by sea and by the long land road through Anatolia, wearing mail in the summer heat, speaking half a dozen languages, filthy and terrifying and utterly foreign. They had taken Antioch after a siege of appalling suffering. They had taken Jerusalem in 1099 and killed most of the people inside it, in an act of slaughter so complete that the chroniclers on both sides struggled to describe it. And then, to the astonishment of everyone, including themselves, they had stayed. By Saladin's boyhood, the Franks had been in the Levant for 2 generations. They had built 4 states along the coast and the hills behind it. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa far inland to the northeast. They had built castles, enormous ones, black basalt and pale limestone, piled into towers that squatted on every strategic hill and watched every road. They had learned to wear loose robes over their armor and to drink chilled fruit syrup. Some of them had been born in the East and had never seen Europe, spoke Arabic, employed Muslim doctors, and were regarded by newly arrived crusaders from France and Germany as suspiciously soft and half-native. And crucially, for the first 2 generations, the Muslim world had not answered them with anything like unity. The Franks had not conquered a strong empire. They had walked into a vacuum and settled in it, and the local rulers had responded exactly as they responded to each other, which is to say, opportunistically. Damascus allied with Jerusalem against Aleppo. Aleppo allied with Jerusalem against Damascus. Tribute was paid, truces were signed, caravans passed, and the coastal cities of Tyre and Acre and Tripoli did a roaring trade in pepper and silk and sugar that made everyone rich enough to keep the arrangement going. The idea that the Franks were a religious catastrophe demanding a united response was not obvious to anyone at first. It had to be built. It had to be argued for, funded, preached in mosques, written into poems, carved into inscriptions above city gates, and the men who built it were not Arabs but Turks, and they built it slowly, over 50 years, mostly because it was politically useful to them. The first of these was a hard, cold, brilliantly effective warlord named Zengi, who ruled Mosul and then Aleppo, and who in 1144 did something no Muslim commander had managed in half a century. He captured a Crusader capital. Edessa fell, the first of the 4 Frankish states to be erased, and across the east, the news traveled like a struck bell. Poets who had never cared about the Franks suddenly discovered that they cared enormously. Zengi was given the title of the Adornment of Islam. 2 years later, he was murdered in his tent by one of his own slaves over a matter of stolen wine, and his lands were divided between his sons. The son who inherited Aleppo was named Nur al-Din, and he would become the most important man in Saladin's life. But before Nur al-Din, before Cairo and Jerusalem and the long war for the coast, there was a small fortress town on the Tigris, and a family of Kurdish soldiers with nothing much to their name, and a night in which they were told to leave before dawn. The family came from the mountains. Their people were Kurds, from the highlands around Divin in the far north, a region of stone villages and long winters and thin pasture, where men had for centuries made a living by fighting for whoever was paying. There was no shame in it and no glamour either. Kurdish soldiers were valued across the Islamic world as tough, mobile, loyal enough while employed, and cheaper than Turks. They served as auxiliaries and garrison troops and castle wardens. They were rarely given cities to rule, and they were never expected to found dynasties. At some point early in the 12th century, a man named Shadi left the mountains with his 2 sons and went looking for work in Iraq. The elder son was called Ayub, which is the Arabic form of Job, a quiet name for a quiet man. The younger was called Shirkuh, which means lion of the mountain, and he lived up to it in every particular. Ayub was thoughtful, diplomatic, patient, a man who read the room. Shirkuh was short, heavy, one-eyed, ferocious, greedy for meat and for battle, and possessed of a physical courage that even his enemies found unreasonable. Between them, they had exactly the 2 skill sets required to rise in that world. They found their opening at Tikrit, a fortress on a bluff above the Tigris, halfway between Baghdad and Mosul. It was a customs post and a river crossing and a prison, and it needed a reliable commander. Ayub was given the governorship. Shirkuh came to live with him. For a few years, the family had a home, a stone tower over brown water, a garrison to feed, tolls to collect, and a modest place in the world. 2 things happened at Tikrit that changed everything. The first was an act of kindness that was also an act of political judgment. In 1132, the warlord Zengi, badly beaten in battle and fleeing south with the wreckage of his army, arrived at the Tigris opposite Tikrit with no boats and an enemy force closing behind him. Ayub ferried him across. He had no orders to do so, and it was dangerous. And it made him a friend of the most ruthless man in Iraq. Zengi did not forget it. The second was a killing. Shirkuh, in a quarrel whose details the sources handle vaguely, killed a man in Tikrit. Some say it was over the honor of a woman. Some say it was simply Shirkuh being Shirkuh. Whatever the cause, the family's position collapsed overnight. The governor of Baghdad ordered them out, and so, on a night in the year 1137, Ayub and Shirkuh gathered their households, their servants, their horses, and their children, and rode out of the gate of Tikrit in the dark, heading north for Mosul in the protection of the man they had once ferried across a river. On that night, or so the story was told afterward, a son was born to Ayub. They named him Yusuf. The birth in flight became one of the great set pieces of later biography, and it may even be true. Certainly, the family treated it as an omen, though at first they read it as a bad one. One of the household is supposed to have suggested leaving the newborn behind, since the journey was hard and the child might not survive it, and Ayub is supposed to have refused. The boy who would take Jerusalem entered the world as a piece of inconvenient baggage, on a road out of a town his family had been expelled from. Zengi received them well. He gave Ayyub the governorship of Baalbek in the Lebanese mountains, a town built on a Roman temple complex so enormous that the medieval fortress simply nested inside the ruins like a bird in a cracked skull. The columns of the Temple of Jupiter were taller than anything the family had ever seen, 6 of them still standing, honey-colored in the afternoon. This was where Yusuf spent his early childhood, playing in the shadow of stones that had been ancient before Islam existed, hearing the wind move through a colonnade built for gods nobody worshipped anymore. When Zengi was murdered in 1146, Ayyub read the situation with his usual cool intelligence, negotiated his own surrender of Baalbek to the ruler of Damascus, and was rewarded with a high position in that city. Shirkuh went the other way, north to Aleppo, into the service of Zengi's son Nur al-Din. The brothers had in effect placed bets on both horses. It was a family strategy as much as an accident, and it would pay off spectacularly. So Yusuf grew up in Damascus, which was in those years the most livable, great city on earth. It sat in a green oasis under the shoulder of a dry mountain, watered by the river Barada, which split into 7 channels and ran through the gardens and the courtyards and the public fountains and out into orchards of apricot and walnut that stretched for miles. Travelers coming out of the desert saw it from a distance as a green stain under a bright sky and thought of paradise, and said so, repeatedly, in 1,000 poems. Inside the walls, the streets were narrow and shaded and cool, roofed here and there with vine and matting. Water ran everywhere. You could hear it under the floors. The Umayyad Mosque at the center had been a Roman temple, then a Christian cathedral, then a mosque, and its courtyard was paved in marble so pale that at noon it hurt to look at, and its walls carried a mosaic of a river and trees, and impossible palaces in green and gold glass, a vision of a garden that no one living had ever entered. The boy who grew up in that city was not, by any account, a young warrior in the making. He was studious, unusually so for a soldier's son. He learned the Quran and law and the sayings of the Prophet and Arabic poetry, of which he retained an enormous quantity for the rest of his life, and could produce from memory at appropriate moments, which was a valued social skill. He knew the genealogies of Arabian horses. He is said to have been interested in mathematics. He was a decent polo player. He was quiet in company, disliked coarse talk, and had a habit of listening to a man completely before answering him, which people found either impressive or unnerving depending on their own habits. What he was not, apparently, was ambitious. Later, when he was the most powerful man in the Muslim world, he told a friend that the last thing he had ever wanted was Egypt, and that when the campaign that made him was first proposed, he had felt as though a knife were being twisted in his heart. Perhaps it was modesty performed after the fact, but his early career supports it. He served in Damascus in a minor administrative post. He served on his uncle's staff. He did not distinguish himself. Through his 20s, he was, as far as anyone could tell, a competent young man attached to a rising family, likely to end as the governor of some middling town. The man who would change that was already in place and already remarkable. Nur al-Din, the son of Zengi, ruled Aleppo from 1146 and Damascus from 1154, and for a quarter of a century he was the pivot on which the Muslim East turned. Tall, dark, unsmiling, with a long face and a thin beard, he lived with a severity that startled people who had grown used to the luxury of princes. He wore plain wool. He ate what his soldiers ate. He forbade wine and music at his court and closed the taverns in his cities. He is said to have kept only what the law allowed him from the state treasury, and to have supported his household from the rent of a few shops he had bought with his own share of plunder. When his wife complained that she had not enough money, he told her he could not take from the treasury of the Muslims for her comfort. and gave her the income of 3 small properties instead, and told her that was all there was. Some of this is the polish of pious biographers. Enough of it survives in hostile sources to suggest the core was real. And whether the austerity was genuine or a performance, it was politically devastating, because it gave him something his rivals could not buy. He looked like the answer to a question the age had begun asking. That question was about the Franks. Nur al-Din did what his father had only begun. He made the recovery of Jerusalem the announced purpose of his rule, and he built the intellectual machinery to support it. He funded scholars who wrote treatises on the merits of holy war. He endowed colleges, dozens of them, and the men who taught in them preached what he needed preached. He restored mosques and built hospitals, and had inscriptions carved on the gates of his cities, calling himself the fighter of the holy war and the defender of the frontier. He commissioned, years before he had any hope of using it, a magnificent carved wooden pulpit, a minbar of cedar and ebony inlaid with ivory and interlocking stars, and he had it stored in Aleppo to be installed one day in the mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He never saw it placed. That would be someone else's work. He also did the unglamorous thing that mattered more than any of it. He took Damascus. In 1154, after years of pressure and one convenient failed Crusader siege that discredited the Damascene policy of alliance with Jerusalem, the city opened its gates to him. For the first time in generations, Aleppo and Damascus obeyed one man. The northern half of the Frankish problem now faced a single enemy instead of a quarreling neighborhood. But one piece was still missing, and Nur al-Din knew exactly which one. Egypt. Egypt was the great prize of the medieval Mediterranean, and it had been for 3,000 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with religion or dynasty. The Nile flooded every summer, spread silt over the fields, and withdrew, and the land produced grain in quantities that no other territory in the region could approach. Egypt fed cities. It also sat astride the trade in pepper and cinnamon and ginger that came up the Red Sea from India and passed overland to Alexandria and from there to Italy. And that trade was so lucrative that Venetian and Pisan merchants would take almost any risk and swallow almost any humiliation to keep their share of it. Whoever held Egypt held money, food, and a fleet, and Egypt in the 1160s was rotting from the inside. The Fatimid Caliph was a boy named Al-Adid, the 14th of his line, who had come to the throne at 9 years old. He lived deep inside a palace complex in the middle of Cairo, a walled city within a city, with its own gardens and menageries and gates that ordinary Egyptians never passed. Almost nobody saw him. His authority was total in theory and negligible in fact. Around him, the palace bureaucracy continued its ancient routines, the ceremonial processions on the great feast days, the distribution of robes of honor, the inspection of the flood gauge that measured the rising Nile, while outside the walls the state was being torn apart by 2 men. Their names were Shawar and Durgam, and they were rival claimants to the vizierate. And between 1163 and 1169, they and their successors turned Egypt into a bidding war. Driven out of Cairo, Shawar fled north to Syria and offered Nur al-Din a fortune to restore him. Nur al-Din, who had wanted an excuse for a decade, sent an army under his best field commander. The commander was Shirkuh, and Shirkuh, needing a staff officer and having a nephew idling in Damascus, took the young man with him. Yusuf went to Egypt for the first time in 1164, in his middle 20s, on a campaign he had no interest in, as a junior member of his uncle's household. That first expedition set the pattern for everything that followed. Shirkuh marched south across Sinai and put Shawar back in power in Cairo, and Shawar, having got what he wanted, immediately decided that his Syrian rescuers were a greater danger than the men they had removed. He turned around and invited the Franks in. King Amalric of Jerusalem, who had been watching Egypt with an appetite of his own, came down the coast road with a Frankish army and joined the Egyptian vizier against the Syrians. Shirkuh dug himself into the town of Bilbays in the delta and held it for 3 months against the combined force, and the young Yusuf served in that siege and learned in the worst possible circumstances what it is to be surrounded. In the end, both foreign armies agreed to withdraw simultaneously, having achieved nothing but the discovery that Egypt could be invaded. The second expedition came 2 years later, in 1167, and it was stranger and more brilliant. Shirkuh came south again, this time to conquer rather than to restore. Shawar and Amalric allied again against him. Shirkuh crossed to the west bank of the Nile and marched south, deep into Upper Egypt, drawing the allied army after him into country where they had no supplies and no friends. And at a place called Al-Babain he turned and fought them. He gave the right wing to his nephew. It was, on paper, an unequal battle. Shirkuh's plan was to weaken the center, let the heavy Frankish cavalry charge into it, and then close on them from both sides while their momentum carried them past. It worked, more or less. In the chaos and dust of a fight in soft ground beside the river, and the young man on the right did what he had been told to do, and did it well. It was the first time Yusuf commanded anything that mattered. Amalric escaped, the allies broke, and Shirkuh, with a smaller force and no base, was suddenly loose in Egypt. He then did something audacious. He rode north at speed all the way to Alexandria and took it, and left his nephew inside it with a garrison, while he went back south to keep the field. The allied army closed on Alexandria and besieged it, and for 4 months in the heat of a delta summer, the young Yusuf held the greatest port in the Mediterranean with a small force, short of food, with a hostile population outside and an uncertain one within. He was in his late 20s. Ships blockaded the harbor. Stone-throwing engines worked on the walls. The people of the city began to starve, and he had to manage them as well as the walls, which is the harder half of a siege. He did not lose it. When terms were finally agreed and both armies once again withdrew, the Franks, who had spent the summer trying to break down his gates, entertained him honorably. Some of their young knights, in the peculiar chivalric fashion of the time, were said to have taken a liking to him. The third expedition was the one that changed the world, and it happened because Amalric got greedy. In 1168, the king of Jerusalem, encouraged by advisors who saw Egypt as ripe fruit, broke his treaty with Shawar and invaded on his own account. His army stormed Bilbays and massacred the population, Muslim and Coptic Christian alike, which destroyed at a stroke any possibility that Egyptians might see the Franks as a lesser evil. The Frankish army moved on Cairo. Shawar, in a panic, set fire to the old city of Fustat to deny it to them, and the fires burned for weeks, consuming the streets where the ordinary people of Egypt actually lived, while the palace quarter stood untouched behind its walls. And the boy Caliph al-Adid, cornered, sent a letter to Nur al-Din in Damascus begging for help, and enclosed with it, according to the story, locks of hair from the women of his palace, as a message that Muslim women were about to fall into Frankish hands. Nur al-Din sent Shirkuh for the 3rd time. And Shirkuh, whose nephew had by now had quite enough of Egypt, had to argue him into coming. Yusuf later said that he went reluctantly, like a man being led to his execution. He went. They did not have to fight. The Franks, seeing a Syrian army coming and having no wish to be caught between it and a hostile Cairo, withdrew. Shirkuh entered the capital in January 1169 as the savior of the Fatimid state. 2 weeks later, Shawar, who had schemed with everyone against everyone for 6 years, was seized on a ride outside the city and beheaded. And the Caliph, with what may have been relief, appointed Shirkuh as vizier of Egypt. Shirkuh had spent his whole life climbing toward exactly this. He was now the effective ruler of the richest country in the Muslim world. He enjoyed it for 2 months and 5 days. He was a heavy eater, and he had a heavy man's constitution. And after a particularly large meal, he suffered what sounds like a stroke or a coronary and died in his bath. And so the Syrian officers in Cairo, and the Fatimid court behind them, had to choose a successor. And here, in one of the great accidents of history, several parties made the same mistake at the same time for different reasons. The Fatimid court wanted a weak vizier, a young man without a following, someone they could manage while they rebuilt their position. The Syrian commanders, who all detested each other and could not agree on any of their own number, wanted a compromise candidate who would not favor a rival faction. And Nur al-Din, far away in Damascus, wanted an obedient deputy who would hold Egypt in his name and remit its revenues northward, not a rival empire builder. All three of them looked at Shirkuh's quiet, bookish, 31-year-old nephew and saw the man they needed. In March 1169, Yusuf ibn Ayyub was appointed vizier of Egypt and given the honorific by which the world would know him. He was now Salah al-Din, and he was the servant of a Shia caliph he did not believe in, the deputy of a Sunni master 3 weeks' ride away, and the commander of an army of Turkish and Kurdish officers, most of whom considered themselves his equals, and several of whom had expected the job themselves. Almost nobody expected him to survive the year. What followed was a masterclass in the quiet accumulation of power, conducted without a single dramatic gesture. The first problem was the army in Cairo, and it was not his army. The Fatimid state maintained a standing force of some tens of thousands, most of them black African infantry recruited from Nubia and the Sudan, professional soldiers with their own quarters, their own commanders, and a deep institutional loyalty to the caliph and the palace. They had watched the Syrians take over the government, and they did not intend to accept it. In the summer of 1169, the palace eunuch who commanded the caliph's household troops opened a secret correspondence with the king of Jerusalem, proposing a joint attack that would catch Saladin between them. Saladin found out. How he found out is disputed, and one version has a spy disguised as a beggar carrying a letter in a shoe. He had the eunuch killed. And the African regiments, hearing of it, rose in the streets of Cairo in a revolt that lasted 2 days and turned the area between the palaces into a battlefield. Saladin won it by a combination of street fighting and a decision that was characteristic of him in its coldness. While the fighting raged in the center, he sent men to burn the quarter where the soldiers' families lived. The regiments broke off and ran for their homes. It was over by evening. The survivors were expelled from Egypt or absorbed, and the Fatimid army, the institution that had defended the dynasty for 2 centuries, ceased to exist. The second problem was the Franks, and they solved it for him by trying once more. In the autumn of 1169, King Amalric came back with a fleet from the Byzantine emperor and besieged Damietta at the mouth of the Nile. The siege went badly. The seasons turned. Disease spread through the camp. The Greek fleet ran short of supplies and quarreled with the Frankish command, and after 50 days they went home. Saladin had barely needed to fight. But the failure cost the kingdom of Jerusalem enormously in credibility and in money, and it announced that the window in which Egypt might have been taken had closed. The third problem was the caliph, and this one had to be handled with extraordinary care. Egypt had been ruled by the Fatimids for 200 years, and the Fatimids were Ismaili Shia, a branch of Islam that regarded the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as an usurper and their own imam as the divinely guided head of the community. Saladin was a Sunni. Nur al-Din was a Sunni and an unusually rigorous one, and he wanted the Fatimid Caliphate abolished and Egypt returned to the Abbasid fold, and he wanted it done immediately. He sent letters, he sent reminders. He began to grow suspicious of a deputy who kept explaining that the time was not yet right. Saladin's caution was not weakness. He knew what Nur al-Din did not, which was how the streets of Cairo would react. So he moved by inches over 2.5 years, and every inch was procedural rather than dramatic. He replaced Shia judges with Sunni ones, court by court. He founded colleges teaching Sunni law and staffed them with scholars brought from Syria. He altered the wording of the call to prayer. He dismissed palace officials and did not replace them. He took over the administration of the caliph's own estates. He moved his family into positions of authority, one relative at a time, until the government of Egypt was largely composed of men named Ibn Ayyub. And then in September 1171, with the young Caliph al-Adid lying gravely ill in his palace, the Friday sermon in the mosques of Cairo was preached in the name of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. It is said that a single preacher did it first, on his own initiative, and that when the city did not riot, the rest followed the next week. The Fatimid Caliphate, the rival empire of the Shia, the state that had built Cairo and challenged Baghdad for 2 centuries, ended not with a battle but with a change of name in a weekly prayer, and hardly anyone in the city seemed to mind. Al-Adid died a few days later, aged 20, apparently without ever being told. Saladin gave him a respectful funeral and attended it. He then had the palace complex inventoried and cleared. The library, one of the greatest in the world, was sold off and dispersed over years. The treasury of jewels and relics and curiosities accumulated over 2 centuries was distributed to soldiers and to Nur al-Din. The Fatimid family was placed under comfortable arrest, men separated from women so that the line would end, and the doors of the palaces were open to functionaries and stables. Saladin was now, at 34, the master of Egypt. He was also technically still an employee. The years between 1171 and 1174 were the most dangerous of Saladin's life, and almost nothing happened in them. That was the danger. The relationship between master and deputy had begun to curdle. Nur al-Din in Damascus had an entirely reasonable expectation. He had conquered Egypt through his officers, and Egypt should therefore pay. He wanted revenue transferred north. He wanted an accounting of the Fatimid treasure. And above all, he wanted joint campaigns against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with the Syrian army coming down from the north and the Egyptian army coming up from the south, catching the Franks between 2 fires with no possibility of escape. It was strategically obvious. It should have ended the Crusader states within a decade. Twice it was arranged, and twice it failed, and both times it failed because Saladin turned back. In 1171, the Egyptian army moved up into the desert east of the Dead Sea and besieged the great Crusader castle of Shobak. In the highland province, the Franks called Ultra-Jourdain. Nur al-Din marched south to join him, and when the Syrian army was only a few days away, Saladin abandoned the siege and withdrew to Egypt, offering the explanation that trouble at home required his presence. In 1173, the same thing happened at the castle of Kerak, an even more formidable fortress on the caravan road, and again Saladin lifted the siege as his master approached. His officers understood why, even if they disagreed. If the 2 armies ever actually met and campaigned together, Nur al-Din would be present in person on Egyptian soil with a larger force, and the fiction that Saladin was an obedient governor would be tested in the only way that mattered. If Jerusalem fell to a joint effort, There would be no buffer left between Egypt and Damascus, and Egypt would be absorbed. Saladin's position depended, precisely and uncomfortably, on the Crusader states continuing to exist. He wrote letters of exquisite deference. He struck coins in Nur al-Din's name. He had the Friday sermon preached for the Abbasid Caliph first and Nur al-Din second, which was correct protocol and cost nothing. He sent gifts. He also quietly kept the revenue. His father Ayyub, who had come south to join him, and who remained the shrewdest political mind in the family, is supposed to have staged a scene for the benefit of witnesses. When Saladin, in council, expressed doubts about obeying a summons from Damascus, Ayyub is said to have shouted at him in front of the assembled officers that if Nur al-Din ordered it, they would all hand Egypt over without hesitation, and then to have taken his son aside privately and told him to say exactly that in public and to prepare for war in private. Whether or not the words are real, the strategy was. By the spring of 1174, both men were preparing. Nur al-Din had summoned troops from Mosul and was assembling an army whose only plausible target was Egypt. Saladin had recalled his brothers and reinforced the Sinai Road. The confrontation that would have decided who ruled the Muslim East was perhaps 2 months away. In May 1174, Nur al-Din, aged 59, sat down to a game of polo, felt unwell, and went to bed. He had an inflammation of the throat, quinsy in the old term, and he refused to be bled, saying that a man of 60 needed his blood. Within days, he was dead. His heir was a boy of 11 named al-Sali Ismail. Everything that Nur al-Din had spent 30 years building came apart in a season. The commanders in Damascus, the commanders in Aleppo, the Zengid cousins in Mosul, and the eunuch guardians of the boy each grabbed for control. Within weeks, the boy had been carried off to Aleppo by one faction. Damascus was being run by an uneasy committee, and the king of Jerusalem, seeing his chance, was extracting tribute from the Syrians for a promise not to attack. Ayyub died that year, thrown from a horse in Cairo. Saladin lost his father and his master within months of each other, and was, for the first time in his life, answerable to no one. He moved with a speed that surprised everyone, and he moved dressed in law. His claim was that the boy al-Sali was surrounded by bad advisors who were selling his inheritance to the Franks, and that he, Saladin, as the most loyal servant of the House of Zengi, was coming to protect the child and to preserve the holy war. It was a thin story and everyone knew it, and it was also just plausible enough to give waverers a reason to open a gate. In October 1174, he rode north from Egypt with 700 horsemen, which was not an invasion force but an escort, precisely so that it would not look like an invasion. He crossed the desert, came up to Damascus, and the city let him in without a fight. He rode to the citadel, and then he did the thing that people remembered. He went to the house where he had lived as a boy, and he sat in the courtyard, and he distributed money to everyone who came, and he handed out sweets to the children in the street. Aleppo did not open. Aleppo fought, and it fought for 9 years. The war that followed was, in every practical sense, a Muslim civil war, and Saladin's critics said so at the time and never stopped saying it. He fought 2 pitched battles against Zengid armies in the hills near Hama and outside Aleppo, and won both. He took Homs and Hama and Baalbek, the town where he had grown up. He besieged Aleppo twice without taking it. He fought the ruler of Mosul, the head of the senior branch of the family, whose servant he had been. And in the middle of it he obtained from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad a formal diploma of investiture, a document naming him as the rightful ruler of Egypt and Syria, which converted a rebellion into a legitimate government by the simple application of paperwork. The people of Aleppo, defending their walls against him, put a young girl in the streets, to walk before the crowds and remind them that they were fighting for their orphaned prince. It worked well enough to keep the city out of his hands. It did not stop him from taking everything around it. Twice during these years he nearly died, and both times the killers came from the same place. In the mountains of northern Syria, in a cluster of fortresses centered on a crag called Masyaf, lived a community that the Franks called the Assassins, and that called itself something quieter. They were Nizari Ismailis, a Shia sect with a lineage of grievance against nearly everyone, and under their Syrian leader Rashid al-Din Sinan, a man the Crusaders knew as the Old Man of the Mountain. They had perfected a form of politics that required no army. They sent one man. He would live in a target city for months or years, take service in a household, be unremarkable, and then on a chosen day walk up and use a knife. It was cheap, it was terrifying, and it made small numbers of people impossible to ignore. The first attempt came in 1175 near Aleppo, and the killers reached Saladin's tent before they were cut down. The second came the following year in his camp outside Azaz, and one of them got close enough to strike at his head. He was wearing a mail hood under his cap. The blade slid off, and a bodyguard caught the man's wrist. And Saladin sat afterward with the blood of the attackers on the ground in front of his tent, badly shaken, and thereafter slept in a wooden tower built to be carried with the army, and let no one approach him whom he did not personally recognize. He then marched into the mountains and besieged Masyaf, and then, abruptly, lifted the siege and went away, and the two sides never troubled each other again. What happened is unknown. The stories that grew up afterward are wonderful and unverifiable. In the most famous, Saladin woke one night in his heavily guarded tent to find hot cakes of a distinctive kind beside his bed, still warm, with a poisoned dagger pinning a note that said he was a dead man whenever the old man chose. Whatever the truth, the message was received. By 1183, 9 years after he entered Damascus, the work in Syria was finished. The boy al-Salih had died at 18, probably of illness. Mosul had submitted to a treaty acknowledging Saladin's supremacy and promising troops, and in June of that year the gates of Aleppo finally opened, and Saladin rode into the citadel that Nur al-Din had ruled from, and the empire was whole. Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, the Jazira, Yemen, where his brother had conquered a kingdom for the family, and the Hijaz with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, whose protection carried more prestige than any province. He had spent 12 years assembling it. In all that time, he had fought the kingdom of Jerusalem seriously only once, and he had lost. That defeat is worth telling properly, because it is the part of his life that the legend usually leaves out, and because it explains why what came later mattered so much. In November 1177, Saladin invaded Palestine from Egypt with a large army, expecting no serious opposition. The kingdom of Jerusalem seemed, that autumn, to be at its lowest ebb. Its king was a boy of 16 named Baldwin, and Baldwin had leprosy. He had been diagnosed as a child by his tutor, who noticed that when the boy played rough games with other children, he never complained of pain in his right arm and hand, because he could not feel them. The tutor, who was also a historian, and who wrote the most humane account of the kingdom that survives, understood at once what it meant. Baldwin grew up knowing what was coming: the loss of sensation, then of the use of his hands, then of his sight, then his face, and finally his life, and all of it in public, in front of a court that would have to decide who would rule after him. He was intelligent, courageous, and by every account entirely without self-pity. He rode with his hands bandaged to the reins. In the autumn of 1177, hearing that Saladin's army had spread out to raid across the south with most of the Frankish forces. Away in the north, Baldwin left Jerusalem with a few hundred knights and rode down to the coast. On the 25th of November, near a hill called Montgisard, he came on the Egyptian army strung out and unprepared on the march. The Franks had one weapon, and in the right conditions it was the most destructive instrument on any battlefield in the world. The charge of heavy cavalry in a solid line, men and horses armored, lances couched, hitting at the gallop. It required flat ground, surprise, and total commitment, and it could not be repeated. The Bishop of Bethlehem raised a fragment of the true cross. The 16-year-old leper king, unable to hold a lance, was lifted onto his horse, and they charged. Saladin's army disintegrated. His bodyguard died around him. He escaped on a fast camel across the Sinai, with a fraction of the men he had brought, and lost his baggage, his treasury, and, for a time, his reputation. Bedouin killed stragglers in the desert for their weapons. He reached Cairo, and to prevent panic, he had letters written announcing a victory, and he rebuilt. It took him 10 years to come back with the tool he was missing, and the tool he was missing was not a bigger army. It was a Frankish mistake. The kingdom of Jerusalem, in the years while Saladin was busy taking Aleppo, was destroying itself over a question it could not answer: who would rule when the leper died? Baldwin IV held on far longer than anyone expected, ruling for 11 years while the disease took him apart piece by piece. By the end he could not walk, could not see, and had to be carried in a litter, and he still had himself carried out on campaign, because his presence in the field was worth more than his body could do. But he could not marry, and he could not father an heir. And so the succession ran through his sister, Sibylla, and Sibylla's choice of husband became the central political question of the kingdom. The court split into 2 parties, and the split ran along a fault that had been widening for 50 years. On one side stood the great baronial families who had been born in the East, the Ibelins and their allies, men whose grandfathers had come with the First Crusade and who now owned land, spoke Arabic, negotiated with Muslim neighbors as a matter of routine, and understood that the kingdom survived on truces and trade as much as on walls. On the other side stood the newcomers, adventurers arriving from Europe with nothing but a name and a sword, hungry for land and marriage, contemptuous of the compromises of the resident nobility, and eager for the war that would justify their coming. Sibylla married one of the newcomers. His name was Guy of Lusignan. He was handsome, well-mannered, poorly regarded, and easily led. And when Baldwin died in 1185, and Sibylla's small son by an earlier marriage died a year later, Guy became king of Jerusalem in a hurried coronation that half the barony refused to recognize. Raymond of Tripoli, the most experienced soldier in the kingdom, and the man who had governed during the king's illness, withdrew to Tiberias in fury, and opened his own negotiations with Saladin. And in the highlands east of the Dead Sea sat the man who would light the fire. Reynald of Chatillon had come out from France as a young knight with no prospects, married his way into the Principality of Antioch, and spent his career doing things that appalled even his own side. He had once tortured the Patriarch of Antioch by having his head smeared with honey and leaving him bound on a roof in the summer sun to attract insects in order to extract money. He had raided Byzantine Cyprus, a Christian island, and mutilated priests. He had spent 16 years in a prison in Aleppo, which did nothing to soften him, and on his release he married the heiress of Ultra-Jourdain and took possession of the castles of Kerak and Shorbak, which straddled the road between Cairo and Damascus. From there, in the early 1180s, he did the thing that made Saladin hate him personally. He had ships built in sections, carried them on camels across the desert to the Gulf of Aqaba, assembled them on the shore, and launched a squadron into the Red Sea, where no Frankish vessel had ever sailed. His men burned shipping, sacked the port of Idab, where the pilgrim traffic crossed to Arabia, took a ship full of pilgrims bound for Mecca, and raided down the Arabian coast toward the holy cities themselves. It was, in strategic terms, a spectacular and pointless provocation. In symbolic terms, it was catastrophic, because the ruler who could not protect the road to Mecca had no business calling himself the defender of Islam. Saladin's brother caught the raiders. Those taken were executed, some of them at Mina, outside Mecca, during the pilgrimage, in public as a demonstration. Saladin swore that if Reynold ever fell into his hands, he would kill him with his own hand. Then, in the winter of 1187, with a truce in force between the kingdom and Saladin that both sides badly needed, Reynold attacked a large caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, seized the goods, and imprisoned the traders. When Saladin sent to demand restitution under the terms of the truce, Reynold refused. When King Guy ordered him to comply, he refused that too, and pointed out that he was lord in his own land. Saladin had spent his whole career waiting for a reason that would hold his coalition together, because the emirs of Mosul and the Jazeera would not campaign year after year for a cause that looked like empire building. Reynold had just handed him one that no one could argue with. In the spring of 1187, for the first time, he summoned every contingent from every province of his territories, and they came. Before the armies met, though, it is worth walking for a while through the world that Saladin had built, because the war is only half the story, and the other half is the reason the war mattered. Egypt under his rule was quieter and more prosperous than it had been for a century. The 200-year Fatimid experiment was over, and the country had returned to the Sunni majority to which most of its population had always belonged. And the transition, remarkably, had cost almost no blood after the first year. Saladin's method of government was the method he had learned from Nur al-Din, adapted and softened. He built colleges and endowed them permanently with the rents of shops and farms, so that a school once founded would go on paying its teachers for centuries, whatever happened to the government. He built hospitals in Cairo and Alexandria where treatment was free, and the wards were divided by illness, with separate sections for fevers, for eye disease, for surgery, and for the insane, and with musicians employed to play for patients who could not sleep. He appointed his own doctors and consulted them constantly, being a man of uncertain health who took a personal interest in medicine. One of the physicians at his court was a refugee from Spain named Musa ibn Maimun, a Jewish scholar whom Europe would come to know as Maimonides, and who wrote a letter describing his working day that still exhausts anyone who reads it. He rode out to the Sultan's household in the morning, spent the day there, returned to Cairo in the afternoon to find his own house full of patients of every faith waiting in the courtyard, and treated them until nightfall, writing prescriptions lying down from fatigue. And this was normal. Above Cairo, on a spur of the Muqattam Hills, where the air was cleaner and cooler than in the crowded lanes below, Saladin began the citadel. It took years, and it was finished by his successors, but the conception was his. A fortress high enough to see the whole delta on a clear morning, with round towers of stone quarried from the outer casings of the smaller pyramids at Giza, and a well-cut 300 feet down through solid rock to the water table, worked by oxen walking in circles on 2 levels so that the garrison could never be thirsted out. He also began a single wall meant to enclose Cairo, Fustat, and the citadel together in one circuit. The prisoners of war taken from the Franks were put to work on it. From that hill, the rulers of Egypt would govern for the next 700 years. The trade that had made the Fatimids rich went on making the Ayyubids rich. Ships came up the Red Sea from Aden with pepper and cinnamon and Indian cotton. Caravans crossed to the Nile and floated down to Alexandria, where Italian merchants from Venice and Pisa and Genoa lived in fortified compounds with their own churches and warehouses, and quarreled with each other in the streets. They traded with Saladin steadily. Throughout the years he was fighting their co-religionists, and he protected them carefully, and their governments in Italy sent occasional letters of protest to the Pope explaining why this was unavoidable. Timber and iron came east in those ships, and both were used to build the fleet and the siege engines that would be used against the Crusader ports. Everyone involved understood this. Nobody stopped. The court itself was famously informal by the standards of the age. Saladin held audience in a tent when campaigning, and in a modest hall when not, sat on a carpet rather than a throne, and let almost anyone approach with a petition. He kept no wine and no music, in the manner of Nur al-Din, but unlike Nur al-Din he was funny, and the men around him were devoted to him in a way that was noticed. His secretary and biographer, a scholar from Mosul named Baha al-Din, wrote of watching him weep during a reading of the Quran, and of him receiving in the same afternoon a man whose son had been killed in his service, and giving away far more than the treasury could support, and of his officials trying and failing to keep him from emptying it. His generosity was so extreme that his own administrators regarded it as a character flaw. He gave away conquered provinces to relatives and to former enemies. He gave away his personal share of plunder before the counting was finished. He once gave a petitioner a village he had already promised to someone else, and then had to buy it back. He died with 47 silver pieces and 1 gold piece to his name, and no house, no land, and no possessions, which was not an accident but the result of a lifetime of deliberate policy, and which caused a small crisis at his funeral. His family was enormous, and it was the real machinery of the empire. He had many sons, 17 of them by various accounts, and brothers, nephews, and cousins in every direction, and the Ayyubid system of rule was to give each of them a city with its own revenues and army, bound to the head of the family by oath and blood rather than by any central bureaucracy. His brother Al-Adil, patient and cunning, and by far the ablest of them, governed Egypt in his absence. His brother Turan Shah conquered Yemen. His nephew Taqi al-Din commanded the vanguard in most of his battles. It made the empire fast, flexible, and personally loyal in the short term. It also made it, in the long term, a set of separate principalities held together by nothing more durable than family feeling. And family feeling has a well-documented shelf life. By the spring of 1187, the family was assembled, the treasury was open, and the summons had gone to every province. In late June, the army crossed the Jordan and came up onto the plateau west of the Sea of Galilee. Contemporary estimates put it at some 12,000 horsemen and a large body of infantry and volunteers, which, if roughly right, made it the largest force any Muslim commander had put into Palestine since the Franks arrived. The Kingdom of Jerusalem answered by stripping itself bare. Every castle was emptied of its garrison, every town of its militia. Treasure sent from England as penance for the murder of an archbishop was used to hire mercenaries. Guy assembled perhaps 1,200 knights, a few thousand mounted sergeants, and 15 or more thousand foot, and camped at the springs of Safaria, in good grazing country with abundant water, about 15 miles from where Saladin waited. Saladin needed them to leave that water. So he attacked the town of Tiberias on the lake shore, took it in an afternoon, and besieged the citadel, into which the Countess Esquiva had withdrawn with her household. She was the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, and Raymond was in the Frankish camp. That night the council of the kingdom met in the king's tent to decide. Raymond spoke first, and he spoke against relieving his own wife. He knew the ground. Between Sapphira and Tiberias lay 15 miles of dry upland with no reliable water in high summer, and an army in mail crossing it in July would arrive at the lake unable to fight. He said, according to the chroniclers, that they should stay where they were, that Tiberias was his, and his wife was in it, and he would rather lose both than lose the kingdom. And that castles could be retaken, but an army destroyed could not be replaced. The council agreed with him. The decision was made to hold at the springs. And then, late that night, after the tents had emptied, the Grand Master of the Templars came to King Guy alone and told him that Raymond was a traitor in Saladin's pay, that the army was calling him a coward for hiding behind water, while a Christian lady was besieged, and that a king who would not march was no king. Guy, who had been called weak all his life, and who had a coronation to justify, changed his mind before morning. At dawn on the 3rd of July, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem broke camp and marched east into the hills away from water. The land between Sapphira and the lake is not dramatic. It is a rolling upland of yellow grass and black basalt outcrops, dotted with thistle and thorn, rising gently and then falling away in a long slope toward the water. In early July, the grass is dead and dry as paper, and the stones hold the heat of the day well into the night. There is a village called Lubia, and a saddle of high ground, and above the saddle, 2 rounded volcanic hills that sit side by side, like the humps of a resting animal, which is why they were called the Horns of Hattin. The Frankish army moved out at first light in the standard order of march. The vanguard under Raymond, the king, and the relics of the True Cross in the center, the military orders in the rear. Almost immediately, the harassment began. Light horse archers came in on the flanks, shot and wheeled away, and there was nothing to charge, because charging meant leaving the column and dying alone. The infantry marched inside a screen of crossbowmen who kept the archers at a distance and paid for it with a steady drizzle of casualties. The pace fell to a crawl, the mail heated, the waterskins emptied by mid-morning. By afternoon they had covered perhaps 9 miles and had reached the plateau near Lubia, and there they stopped. The springs they had hoped to reach were held. The wells at Turan behind them had already been drunk dry by the vanguard. Ahead lay a descent to the lake that was blocked. The decision was taken, and it was probably the worst of a bad set, to make camp for the night on the high ground and push through to the water in the morning. The army spent that night without water, in the open, on dry stone, listening. All around them in the dark, out of sight, Saladin's men were talking, singing, calling to one another, beating drums and reciting the Quran. Camel trains came up through the night, bringing arrows in bundles from a depot he had established, and empty waterskins went back to the lake to be refilled. It is recorded that 70 camel loads of arrows were distributed before dawn. And then, when the wind rose before morning, the Muslims set fire to the dry grass upwind of the Frankish camp. The smoke came over the exhausted, thirsty, sleepless army in a rolling grey wall that stank and blinded and got into the throat, and behind the smoke came the arrows. The Franks had not slept. They had not drunk for a day and a half. The horses were failing, and now they could not see. What followed was not really a battle. It was a slow dismemberment that took most of a morning. The column tried to break through toward the lake, and could not. The infantry, maddened by thirst, broke away from the knights and streamed up the slope toward the northern horn. And when the king sent orders for them to come back and screen the cavalry, they refused, and said they were dying of thirst and could not fight. Without the infantry, the knights had no protection from the archers, and the horses began to go down, and a night on foot in that country was finished. Raymond of Tripoli in the vanguard was ordered to charge and clear a way through, He formed up what he had and went down the slope at the gallop, and the Muslim line in front of him simply opened and let him ride through, and closed behind him. He came out the far side on the road to Tyre with a handful of men and could not get back. His enemies said he had arranged it. His defenders said it was the standard response to a heavy charge, and that he had no choice but to keep going. He rode to Tripoli and died within months, and history has not settled the question. On the hill, the last of the army gathered around the king's red tent and the true cross. Twice the surviving knights, on failing horses, charged down at the standards of Saladin, and twice they were driven back. The bishop of Acre who carried the relic was killed, and the cross was taken, and its loss struck the Franks harder than any other single event of that day, because it had been carried at the head of their army since the beginning and had never been lost. When the tent came down, the fighting stopped. Saladin's son Al-Afdal, 17 years old and in his first battle, wrote afterward about standing beside his father and watching the enemy charges come in, and shouting that they had beaten them when the first attack was thrown back, and his father telling him to be quiet, that they had not won until that tent fell. And then it fell, and Saladin dismounted and put his forehead to the ground and wept. The prisoners were brought to his tent in the afternoon. King Guy, grey with thirst, was seated and given a cup of iced rose water, cooled with snow brought down from Mount Hermon, and he drank and passed it to Reynold of Chatillon, who was standing beside him. Saladin said sharply that he had not given the cup to that man, because under the customs of hospitality, a prisoner who has been given food or drink by his captor cannot be executed, and Saladin did not intend to be trapped by his own manners. He then spoke to Reynold and reminded him of the caravan and the oath. He offered him, by some accounts, the chance to convert. Reynold answered him with contempt. And Saladin stood up and struck him with a sword, cutting into his shoulder, and the guards finished it, and the head was dragged out of the tent past the king, who thought he was next. He was not. Saladin told him that kings do not kill kings, and had him treated well and sent to Damascus, and eventually released him. The captured knights of the Templars and the Hospitallers, however, were a different matter, because they were a permanent standing army sworn never to accept ransom or retreat, and everyone released would be back in the field within a season. Some 230 of them were executed on the day after the battle, and Saladin gave the task, in a gesture that appalled his own secretary, to the scholars and ascetics and Sufis, who had come along with the army as volunteers, some of whom had never held a sword and made a clumsy, prolonged job of it. The rest of the captives, thousands of them, went into the slave markets of Damascus, where the price of a healthy man collapsed so completely that a chronicler records one being sold for a pair of sandals. The kingdom of Jerusalem had put everything it had onto that plateau. In one day it had lost effectively its entire field army, its king, its relic, and most of its military nobility. Every castle in the country was now held, if at all, by a handful of old men and boys. What followed was less a campaign than a harvest. Saladin moved at once, and he moved carefully, and he chose to take the coast before the interior, which was strategically correct and psychologically strange, because the interior contained Jerusalem. Ports were the thing that mattered. As long as the Franks held harbors, armies could come from Europe. So Acre fell within a week, and the Italian merchants there were allowed to leave with their goods, and one of Saladin's officers rode into the customs house and found the account book still open. Nablus, Haifa, Caesarea, Nazareth, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, and Ascalon went in the weeks that followed, most of them opening their gates on terms after a token defense, some without a fight at all. Only one place on the whole coast held out, and that failure would cost him everything he was about to win. Tyre stood on what was almost an island, joined to the mainland by a narrow causeway that Alexander the Great had built, and that the sea had widened into a sandbar. It could be attacked only along that strip, in a frontage of a few hundred yards, against walls and towers. Saladin came to it in July, and its governor negotiated surrender, and Saladin permitted him to delay while refugees streamed in from every fallen town. And then, days before the handover, a ship came into the harbor carrying an Italian nobleman named Conrad of Montferrat, who had been sailing to the Holy Land with no idea that any of this had happened, and who took one look at the situation, threw the surrender banners off the walls, took command, and refused to give the city up. Saladin besieged it twice that winter, in bad weather, with an army that had been in the field for 6 months and wanted to go home. He lost ships to a night raid in the harbor. He gave it up. Tyre remained Frankish, and every knight, every sergeant, and every fighting man who escaped from the fall of the rest of the kingdom went there. And within 3 years, it would be the base from which the Third Crusade retook the coast. But that was still ahead. In September 1187, he turned inland at last and came up the road from the coast into the hills of Judea, and on the 20th of the month, his army appeared on the ridge west of Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the autumn of 1187 was a city of women, children, priests, and refugees, and it had almost no soldiers at all. Of the knights who had held it, most were dead on the plateau above Galilee, or in a prison in Damascus. The population had swollen to perhaps 3 or 4 times its normal size as people fled inland from the falling coastal towns, in the belief that the holy city would be defended if nothing else was. There were, by one account, only 2 men of knightly rank inside the walls. One of them was Balian of Ebelin, of the old resident nobility, who had escaped from Hattin and gone to Tyre, and who had then asked Saladin for a safe conduct to enter Jerusalem for a single night in order to bring out his wife and children. Saladin granted it on his oath that he would not stay and would not fight. Balian entered the city, and the people of Jerusalem, seeing the only competent soldier available walking through the gate, surrounded him and begged him not to leave, and the patriarch released him from his oath on the grounds that a greater duty overrode it. Balian, unhappy, wrote to Saladin and explained the situation honestly, and Saladin, who seems to have regarded the whole thing as a legitimate dilemma rather than a betrayal, replied that he understood and sent an escort of 50 of his own horsemen to bring Balian's wife and children safely out of the city to Tyre before the siege began. Then he came up to the walls. Balian knighted every boy of noble birth over 16, and 30 burgesses of the city besides, so that there would be men whose orders others would obey. He melted down the silver from the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to strike coins to pay the defenders. He organized the walls by quarter, and for 12 days the city held, first against attacks from the west near the citadel, and then, when Saladin shifted his camp to the north, against a bombardment and a mine driven under the wall. Near the gate, the Franks called St. Stephen's, close to where the First Crusade had broken in 88 years before. On the 29th of September, a section of the wall came down. At that point, Balian went out under a flag to negotiate, and the conversation that followed is one of the most remarkable in the history of the Crusades, and it survives in versions from both sides that broadly agree. Saladin began by refusing terms altogether. He had sworn, he said, to take the city by the sword as the Franks had taken it, and he had offered generous terms twice already and been refused, and the breach was open. Balian answered him with a threat, and it was not a bluff. He said that if there were no terms, Then the defenders would first kill their own women and children, so that they could not be enslaved. Then they would destroy every possession of value in the city, burn the treasures, and pull down the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, which were the third holiest site in Islam, and which had been in Frankish hands as a palace and a stable for 88 years. Then they would kill the 5,000 Muslim prisoners they held. And then every man of them would come out and fight until they were all dead. And Saladin would take a ruin, and there would be no captives to sell, and no shrine to pray in. Saladin consulted his advisors and the lawyers with the army, who found a formula. If the city surrendered voluntarily, the oath to take it by the sword did not apply. Terms were agreed. The terms were a ransom: 10 dinars for each man, 5 for each woman, 1 for each child, to be paid within 40 days, after which those who had not paid would be enslaved. It was a hard price, high enough that the poor could not possibly meet it, and Balian negotiated a bulk figure of 30,000 dinars for 7,000 of the poorest. Paid out of the treasury the Kingdom of England had sent for the defense of the Holy Land, which was being held in Jerusalem by the Hospitallers. On the 2nd of October, which by the Muslim calendar was the anniversary of the night on which the Prophet was believed to have been carried to Jerusalem in a vision, Saladin's banners went up over the city, and the gates were opened for the departure. What happened over the following weeks was messy, human, and much less clean than the legend, and it is better for being so. The clerks at the gates counted rigorously, and many people were enslaved who could not pay, perhaps 15,000 of them, and that was a real catastrophe for real families. But Saladin also let his commanders and his family compete with each other in generosity, and they did. His brother Al-Adil asked for 1,000 of the poor as his share and freed them on the spot. The Patriarch of Jerusalem walked out of the city with wagons of church treasure, having paid his own 10 dinars and nothing more, and Saladin's advisors urged him to seize it, and he refused on the grounds that the agreement said nothing about property. He released the old, and the husbands of women who had ransomed themselves. And when a procession of widows and orphans of men killed or captured came to him and asked what would become of them, he had their husbands and fathers found among the prisoners and released, and gave money to the rest from his own funds. His treasurers, once again, despaired. The columns of exiles went out through the gates in 3 groups, under escort toward Tyre and Tripoli and the sea. Many of them were turned away by Christian lords along the coast, who robbed them, and the Count of Tripoli shut his gates against them. Some of them were finally taken in and fed at Muslim towns along the road. Inside the city, the work of reconsecration began at once. The great cross that the Franks had set on top of the Dome of the Rock was pulled down and dragged through the streets. The building itself, which had been used as a residence and had been divided internally with walls and hung with images, was scoured with rosewater, brought up in quantity from Damascus. The Aqsa Mosque, which the Templars had used as their headquarters and their stables, was cleared, and its floor was carpeted, and the walls were washed. And on the 27th of October, at the Friday prayer, the pulpit of carved cedar and ebony and ivory that Nur al-Din had commissioned more than 20 years earlier, and that had waited in Aleppo through all those years for a city that was not yet taken, was carried into the Aqsa Mosque and set in place, and the sermon was preached from it. Saladin was there, sitting among the crowd, and the preacher praised him extravagantly, as preachers did. He was 49 years old. He had 6 years left to live, and he would spend nearly all of them fighting to keep what he had just won. The news reached Europe slowly, in stages, and each stage made it worse. A bishop from Tyre traveled west with letters, and appeared before courts and councils to describe what had happened, and the effect was seismic in a way that no crusading appeal had achieved since the first one. The Pope was said to have died of the shock, which is unlikely but was widely believed. A new pope issued a bull, calling for a general crusade and offering full remission of sins, and for the first time a specific tax was levied across England and France to pay for it, a tenth of income and movable goods, remembered afterward with resentment as the Saladin tithe. 3 sovereigns took the cross: the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, nearly 70, and the most prestigious ruler in Europe, set out overland with an army that contemporaries put in the tens of thousands, marched the whole length of the Balkans and Anatolia, defeated the Turks of Konya on the way, and then, in June 1190, while crossing a river in the mountains of Cilicia, fell from his horse into the cold water and drowned. His army disintegrated in grief and disease, and only a fraction of it reached Syria. It was, for Saladin, the single greatest piece of luck of his life, and he knew it. That left the 2 Western kings, and they hated each other. Philip Augustus of France was 25, cautious, calculating, unwarlike, and extremely intelligent, and he wanted to go home almost from the moment he arrived. Richard of England, who was 32, was the opposite in every respect. Enormous, red-haired, loud, a superb battlefield commander, and a competent besieger, greedy, brutal, personally brave to the point of recklessness, and possessed of an instinct for the theatrical that made him famous across the Muslim East within a year. He was also, technically, Philip's vassal for his French lands, which made every campfire argument between them a constitutional crisis. They took 2 years to arrive. In that time, the war restarted without them, in the most improbable way. King Guy of Lusignan, released by Saladin on a promise never to bear arms against him again, had that promise dissolved by his clergy, and found himself a king with no kingdom and no city that would admit him, since Conrad of Montferrat held Tyre and had no intention of handing it over. So Guy, in August 1189, did the only thing available to a man with a few hundred followers and nothing to lose. He marched down the coast and laid siege to Acre, the greatest port in the country, held by a strong Muslim garrison. It was an absurd gesture. It became the longest and most terrible siege of the entire crusading period. Saladin came down with his army and took up a position on the hills behind the besiegers. And from that moment there were 3 armies stacked one behind the other. The Muslim garrison inside the walls of Acre, the Frankish army besieging them, and Saladin's army besieging the besiegers. Ships came in from Europe all through 1190 and 1191, and every ship added men to the middle ring. Ships came in from Egypt when the wind and the blockade allowed, and everyone added supplies to the inner ring. Neither Saladin nor the Franks could break the deadlock, and neither could leave. For 2 years men lived and died in that space. They dug and countermined. They built siege towers sheathed in vinegar-soaked hides against fire, and the defenders burned them anyway with a naphtha compound thrown in pots. A coppersmith from Damascus invented a mixture that destroyed 3 towers in a day and refused payment for it. In the winter of 1190, the Frankish camp starved so badly that men ate their horses, and then the grass, and a plague ran through the tents, and the dead were so numerous that the corpses were used to fill in ditches. In the same winter, Saladin's emirs began quietly going home, because the season was over and their contingents were owed rest, and he could not stop them. And in between the 2 lines, in the pauses, something odd kept happening. Soldiers of both sides met and traded. They watched each other's tournaments. On one recorded occasion, the 2 armies held a joint entertainment in which boys from each side fought a mock battle, and on another, the knights and emirs held a formal jousting exhibition. A Muslim chronicler describes a Frankish wedding celebrated in view of the lines, with the enemy invited to watch the dancing. Then in the morning, the mangonels started again. Philip of France arrived in April 1191. Richard arrived in June, having stopped on the way to conquer Cyprus from a Byzantine rebel, mostly because his sister's ship had been badly treated there and partly because he needed the money, and Cyprus would remain a Christian kingdom for 400 years as a side effect of a bad harbor reception. With the kings came engineers, timber, money, and decisively, a working fleet. The bombardment became continuous. On the 12th of July, 1191, after 23 months, the garrison of Acre surrendered on terms without Saladin's consent, agreeing to a ransom, the return of the True Cross, and the release of Frankish prisoners. Saladin, in his camp on the hills, learned that his own men had surrendered the city while he was still negotiating and had to accept it. The terms then went wrong. The money was to be paid in installments, and the first installment was late, and the prisoner lists did not match, and each side accused the other of bad faith, and the truth is probably that both were stalling. Richard, who had a fleet to feed and a campaign season slipping away and no intention of sitting outside Acre for another winter, made a decision that his admirers have been explaining ever since. On the 20th of August, he had the captured garrison of Acre, some 2,700 men, together with a number of women and children, brought out onto the plain in full view of Saladin's outposts, roped together and killed. Saladin's troops rode down and could not reach them in time. Whatever personal regard had grown between the two commanders through their exchanges of gifts and messages did not survive that afternoon. Saladin executed his own Frankish prisoners in response, and the war, which had for 4 years been conducted with an unusual amount of courtesy between enemies, became for a while simply a war. Richard marched south from Acre a few days later, along the coast road toward Jaffa, and the march itself has been studied ever since as a model of how to move an army through hostile country. He kept the sea on his right and the fleet level with him, so that supplies came ashore each evening, and the wounded could be taken off. He put the baggage on the seaward flank, where it could not be raided. He formed the infantry into a wall on the landward side, with the crossbowmen outermost, and put the cavalry inside that wall where the horses were shielded from arrows. He marched in the early morning and rested in the heat, and he rotated the divisions so that the exhausting rear position, where the harassment was worst, was shared. Saladin's army shadowed them the whole way through the low hills a mile inland, shooting into the column day after day, trying to provoke the charge that would break the formation and expose the horses. The Frankish infantry took it. A Muslim eyewitness describes with astonishment men walking on with several arrows lodged in the padded, felt armor over their mail, not troubling to remove them, refusing to break step. On the 7th of September, in the woodland north of Arsuf, Saladin committed his whole army to force the issue. The pressure on the rear guard, held that day by the Hospitallers, became unbearable. Horses were dying, men were being dragged out of the line, and the master of the hospital rode up the column twice to beg permission to charge, and was refused twice, because Richard was waiting for the moment when the enemy would be fully committed and closest. Then 2 knights of the rear guard broke without orders, and the whole rear went with them, and the choice was gone. Richard did the only thing that could save it. He ordered a general charge along the entire line and turned an act of indiscipline into a coordinated attack. The Muslim army, which had dismounted its archers to shoot more effectively at close range, was caught with men on foot in front of a wall of heavy cavalry at 40 yards. The line was ridden over. Saladin's own guard was scattered and the army fell back into the woods in disorder, and Richard, showing more discipline than any of his critics allow, recalled the pursuit and reformed rather than letting the charge run into the trees where it would have been destroyed. It was not a decisive victory. Saladin's army was not annihilated and reassembled within days, but it broke something more important, which was the belief on both sides, held since Hattin, that Saladin could not be beaten in open field. From that day he never again offered a general engagement to Richard, and instead did the only rational thing left. He retreated in front of him, destroyed everything that could support an army, and let the country do the work. He pulled down the walls of Ascalon, the greatest fortress on the road to Egypt, with his own hands present at the demolition and tears in his eyes as it came down, saying that he would rather lose all his sons than take a single stone from it. But that a fortress the Franks could hold was worse than no fortress at all. He did the same to Ramla and Lydda and a dozen other places. He poisoned wells and burned the harvest across the coastal plain and the approaches to the hills. Twice in the following year, Richard marched up into the Judean hills toward Jerusalem, in winter rain and then again in summer, and twice he came within 12 miles of it and turned back, and each time the army that had come 3,000 miles to see the city wept openly on the road home. The reasoning was cold and correct, and it was Richard's and the resident barons. Taking Jerusalem was possible. Holding it was not. The moment it fell, the Crusaders who had taken it would consider their vows fulfilled and sail home, and the garrison left behind would be a few hundred men in a city with no port, no supply line, and Saladin's army in the hills around it. Legend says Richard covered his eyes with his shield when his companions offered to show him the towers in the distance, saying that a man not worthy to conquer the city should not look upon it. Between the marches and the sieges, the two men talked constantly, and the record of those exchanges is one of the strangest and most likable things to survive from the 12th century. They never met. That was deliberate on Saladin's part, who observed reasonably that kings who meet and then have to fight again are shamed by it, and that they should first agree on terms and meet afterward, which they never did. But messengers went back and forth almost weekly, and the chief go-between was Saladin's brother Aladil, who got on with Richard extremely well, to the irritation of both armies. Gifts moved constantly. Saladin sent fruit and snow from Mount Hermon when Richard was ill with fever at Jaffa, and sent his own physicians. Richard sent falcons. When Richard's horse was killed under him in a skirmish, Aladil sent him 2 fresh horses in the middle of the engagement, with a message that a king should not be on foot. Richard, in turn, proposed at one point a peace settlement of such spectacular oddity that the Muslim chroniclers recorded it with visible enjoyment, that his sister Joanna, the widowed queen of Sicily, should marry Aladil, that the couple should rule the whole coastal region together with Jerusalem as their capital, that Christians should have the holy places and Muslims the rest, and that the 2 dynasties should be joined by marriage. Saladin, expecting the proposal to be withdrawn, accepted it immediately. It was withdrawn. Joanna, when informed, is said to have reacted with fury at the suggestion that she should marry a Muslim, and the plan died there. The war ended, as such wars do, because both sides ran out of the ability to continue. Richard had news from England that his brother John and Philip of France were carving up his lands in his absence, and he could not stay. Saladin had an army that had been mobilized almost continuously for 6 years, emirs who wanted to go home to provinces they had barely seen, and a treasury that his own generosity had helped to empty. In July 1192, he made one last attempt, a sudden strike at Jaffa, that took the town and nearly took the citadel, and Richard came down the coast by ship, jumped into the surf ahead of his men with a crossbow, and retook the place with a force so small that Saladin's officers refused to believe the reports. A few days later, the Muslim army attacked the camp at dawn, and Richard formed a line of spearmen, kneeling with the butts of their spears in the ground, and crossbowmen in pairs behind them, and held off repeated cavalry charges with a couple of thousand men, and then counterattacked. It was the last battle either of them fought. On the 2nd of September 1192, the Treaty of Ramla was signed, and it was to run for 3 years and 8 months. The terms were an honest reflection of the position. The Franks kept the coastal strip from Tyre down to Jaffa, which meant they kept their ports and their trade and their kingdom, though it was now a kingdom of harbors with a capital at Acre. Ascalon's fortifications were to remain demolished. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, and Christian pilgrims were guaranteed free access to the holy places without payment, which was the thing that most ordinary people in Europe had actually wanted all along, and which Saladin had offered repeatedly for years. Richard, who was too ill to travel to Jerusalem, and who had refused on principle to enter it as a tourist when he could not enter it as a conqueror, sent word that when he returned with a new army he would take it. Saladin sent back a message saying that if he had to lose the land, he would rather lose it to Richard than to any other man alive. Richard sailed in October. He was shipwrecked in the Adriatic, captured by an enemy he had insulted at Acre, and spent more than a year in an Austrian and then a German prison while England was taxed nearly to ruin to pay his ransom. He never came back. Saladin rode to Jerusalem, and then in November 1192 he went home to Damascus, to the city he had grown up in and where he had not spent a full winter in more than a decade. The last months were quiet and, by the account of the men who were with him, happy. He was 55 and he looked older. His health had never been robust and the campaigns had used him up. But that winter he did ordinary things. He held audiences in the citadel and let anyone come. He rode out to meet the returning pilgrim caravan from Mecca. He spent time with his children, and his secretary describes him sitting in the gardens with the smallest of them on his knee while a petitioner made a case, and the child bursting into tears at the sight of a Frankish envoy, and the whole audience being suspended while the boy was comforted. He talked about what to do next. He wanted, he said, to settle the affairs of his family, then to leave the armies to his sons and cross the sea himself, or else go on the pilgrimage to Mecca and afterward live quietly. His advisors, who had heard him give away entire provinces on a whim, treated this in the spirit in which such statements are usually received. In February 1193, after riding out to meet the pilgrims returning from Arabia, he came back to the citadel feeling unwell. It began as a fever with lassitude and headache, and it did not lift. Modern readers have suggested typhus. The doctors bled him, which was almost certainly the worst possible treatment, and he weakened rapidly. By the 6th day he could not keep food down. On the 9th he was mostly unconscious. His son Al-Avdal, wanting to secure the oaths of the emirs while there was still a living sultan in the building, called them to swear allegiance at the bedside, which caused exactly the kind of unease among the commanders that it was intended to prevent. He died before dawn on the 4th of March 1193, while a reader beside the bed was reciting the Quran. His secretary Baha al-Din, who was in the room, recorded that when the reader reached a verse saying that there is no God but him, and in him I have put my trust, the dying man smiled, and his face grew calm and he was gone. The household had to borrow money to bury him. His entire personal estate, after a lifetime of ruling Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and the Hijaz, amounted to 47 pieces of silver and 1 gold coin. He owned no house, no garden, no land, and no goods. The straw and the cloth for his grave had to be paid for out of a loan. Damascus closed. The chronicler wrote that the city was as still as a house in mourning, and that the crowds in the streets could not be counted, and that the noise of weeping followed the bier through the gates. He was buried first in the garden of the house where he had died, and later moved to a small domed tomb built beside the Umayyad Mosque, where he lies still in a plain wooden cenotaph, a few steps from the courtyard where the water runs. And within a year of his death, his empire began to come apart, exactly as any observer could have predicted, because he had built it out of relatives. The Ayyubid system had never been an empire in the way that Rome or the early caliphate was an empire. It had no central treasury, no imperial bureaucracy standing above the provinces, and no rule of succession. It was a confederation of family holdings, each with its own army, its own revenues and its own ambitions, held together by the personal authority of one man. When that man died, what remained was a family with grievances and soldiers. Saladin left his sons the 3 great prizes. Al-Afdal, the eldest, took Damascus. Al-Zahir, the ablest, took Aleppo. Al-Aziz, the most impatient, took Egypt. Their uncle Al-Adil, who had governed Egypt for years, run the diplomacy with Richard, and knew every emir in the empire by name, took the lands across the Euphrates and waited. He did not have to wait long. Al-Afdal in Damascus was pious, indolent, and badly advised, and he alienated his father's veteran commanders within a year by handing offices to his own favorites. Al-Aziz marched on Damascus from Egypt. Al-Zahir intrigued from Aleppo. Al-Adil supported first one nephew and then another, always positioning himself as the elder statesman restoring order, and always ending each round of the quarrel with a little more than he had before. In 1198, Al-Aziz died in a hunting accident in Egypt, thrown from his horse chasing a wolf, and the emirs of Cairo, faced with a child heir, sent for the uncle. By 1200, Al-Adil was sultan in Cairo, and by 1202 he had taken Damascus as well, and Saladin's sons had been reduced to pensioners and provincial governors. It had taken 7 years and almost no bloodshed, and it had been done entirely by patience. He then ruled for 18 years, and he was, by any measure that governments are actually judged by, better at the job than his brother had been. Al-Adil's policy was straightforward and deeply unromantic. He wanted no more holy war. The coast was full of Frankish ports, whose merchants paid customs duties. The Italian republics wanted pepper and would pay in silver and timber. Egypt wanted peace and a good flood. He therefore signed truce after truce with the kingdom of Acre, renewed them, extended them, and looked the other way when they were awkward. He reorganized the coinage, restored the flow of the Red Sea trade, completed the citadel of Cairo, fortified the walls of Damascus and Jerusalem, and settled his own sons into the pattern his brother had used, one in Egypt, one in the Damascus. The Franks in Acre, for their part, discovered that they liked this arrangement too. A generation grew up on both sides who had never fought a general war. Pilgrims came and went. Sugar was refined in the coastal plantations and shipped to Europe. Venice built a fortune on it. The papacy in Rome sent increasingly irritated letters, and the Crusades, when they came again, kept going somewhere else. The Fourth Crusade, set out in 1202 to attack Egypt, ran up an unpayable debt to the Venetians who had built its fleet, and was diverted first to a Christian city on the Adriatic, and then to Constantinople itself, which it stormed and sacked in 1204, destroying the Byzantine Empire and looting a Christian capital more thoroughly than any Muslim army ever had. The Ayyubids watched it happen with something close to disbelief, and did not have to lift a finger. The Fifth Crusade, when it finally came exactly where Al-Adil had always known it would, which was to the mouth of the Nile. In 1218, a crusading army landed at Damietta on the eastern branch of the delta and besieged it. The strategy was sound and had been obvious for 50 years. Jerusalem could not be held while Egypt was hostile, so take Egypt first. Al-Adil, old and ill, died a few months into the campaign. Some said of shock at the news that a key tower had fallen and his son Al-Kamil inherited the war. Al-Kamil was his father's son in every way that counted. Patient, unsentimental, more interested in a workable arrangement than in a glorious one. He held Damietta for 17 months and lost it. And then, with the Crusaders in possession of the greatest port in the delta, he made them an offer that stunned his own advisors. He offered them Jerusalem. He would return the Holy City and the True Cross and most of the old kingdom of Jerusalem west of the Jordan in exchange for Damietta and the departure of the army. He offered it twice, and the second time he added a long truce and a payment for the repair of the walls. It was accepted by many of the crusading barons and refused by the papal legate who commanded the expedition, a Spanish cardinal named Pelagius, who believed that God had promised him Egypt and that negotiating with an infidel for a city that was already Christian by right was a sin. So the crusade marched south toward Cairo in the summer of 1221. And Al-Kamil waited until it had passed the point where the Nile canals could be opened, and then he opened them. The flood came up around the army, the ground turned to marsh, the fleet was cut off, and within days the entire expedition was trapped, starving and standing in water. Al-Kamil accepted their surrender, gave them back their army, fed them, and took Damietta back. He asked for nothing else. 8 years later, he did something even stranger, and this time it worked. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, an extraordinary man who had grown up in Sicily among Arabic-speaking scholars, kept Muslim troops in his bodyguard, corresponded with Egyptian and Andalusian philosophers about optics and metaphysics, and had been excommunicated by the Pope for repeatedly failing to go on crusade, finally arrived in the Holy Land in 1228 while still excommunicate. He had no real army. What he had was a long-standing friendly correspondence with Al-Kamil, who was at that moment locked in a dispute with his own brother over Damascus, and wanted above all no war on a second front. The two of them negotiated for months and produced a treaty that satisfied nobody and prevented a war. Jerusalem was handed over to Frederick, unfortified, along with Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast. The Temple Mount, with the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, remained in Muslim hands and under Muslim worship. Muslims retained the right to live in the city. There was a truce of 10 years. Frederick crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with his own hands, because no priest would perform the ceremony for an excommunicated man. He was pelted with offal in Acre by his own side when he left. Al-Kamil was denounced from pulpits from Baghdad to Morocco for surrendering the Holy City, and public mourning was held in Damascus. Both rulers considered the deal a success, and by their own standards they were right. Jerusalem stayed in Christian hands, undefended, for 15 years, and then in 1244 it was taken and sacked by a wandering army of displaced Turkish horsemen driven west out of Central Asia by the Mongols, whom the Ayyubids of Egypt had hired. It never returned to Christian rule. By then the dynasty was in its last generation, and the thing that would destroy it was already inside the palace. The Ayyubids, like every Muslim dynasty of the age, bought slave soldiers. They were taken as boys, mostly from the Turkic steppe north of the Black Sea, converted, trained for years in barracks, in horsemanship and archery and law, freed on completion of training, and bound thereafter to the master who had raised them by ties that were understood to be stronger than family, because they had no family. They were called Mamluks, the owned. They were the finest cavalry in the world, and every sultan wanted more of them. The last effective Ayyubid ruler, Al-Salih Ayyub, wanted more of them than anyone. Distrusting his own relatives, which was reasonable, he built his personal power on an enormous regiment of them, several thousand strong, and quartered them on an island in the Nile at Cairo, from which they took their name, the river Mamluks. They were loyal to him personally and to each other absolutely, and to the Ayyubid family not at all. In 1249, a French king, Louis IX, landed at Damietta with the best-equipped crusade yet assembled, and repeated the Fifth Crusade almost move for move, including the fatal march south along a canal. And in the middle of that campaign, in November 1249, Al-Salih Ayyub died in his camp. What happened next was managed by his widow, a woman of Turkic or Armenian origin who had been a slave in his household and had become the most formidable political operator in Egypt. Her name was Shajar al-Dur, the Tree of Pearls. She concealed the death entirely. Meals continued to be carried into the Sultan's tent. Documents continued to be issued in his name, signed by a trusted eunuch. The army was told the Sultan was ill and could not be disturbed. For 3 months, with a crusading army in the Delta, Egypt was governed by a dead man and the woman who had loved him. She held it together long enough for his son to be brought from the Jazira, and long enough for the Mamluk regiments to smash the crusade at Mansoura and capture the King of France, who was ransomed for an immense sum and released. Then, in May 1250, the new Sultan, having made the mistake of announcing that he intended to replace his father's Mamluks with men of his own, was murdered by them in his own camp, cut down as he fled toward the river with a burning tower behind him. He was the last of Saladin's line to rule Egypt. The Mamluks then made Shajar al-Dur Sultan in her own name, which caused a constitutional scandal across the Islamic world, and coins struck in the name of a woman. She ruled for 80 days, married the commander of the army to make it palatable, and was eventually beaten to death with wooden clogs by the servants of a rival wife and thrown from the walls of the citadel. It was that kind of decade. But the state that emerged from it was the Mamluk Sultanate, and it would govern Egypt and Syria for 267 years. And it would do the two things the Ayyubids had never managed. In 1260, at Ain Jalut in Galilee, not 30 miles from the Horns of Hattin, it defeated a Mongol army in open battle and stopped the westward advance that had already burned Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate. And over the following 3 decades it took, one by one, every remaining Frankish city on the coast, until in 1291 Acre fell, and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, after 192 years, ended entirely. The Ayyubid branches in Syria lingered on for a while as local princes, in Hama and Homs, and up in the Jazira until the Mongols and the Mamluks between them finished the work. The last of them, a scholarly prince and geographer at Hama, who wrote a description of the world that is still read, died in 1331, more than a century after Saladin, and that was the end of the house of Ayyub. The dynasty ended, and the reputation did not. What happened to Saladin's memory afterward is nearly as strange as what he did in life, because it happened mainly in Europe, among the descendants of the people he had defeated. It began almost immediately. Within a generation of his death, Western writers, who had every reason to hate him, were telling stories in which he was the ideal knight. They gave him a European mother, or a secret Christian baptism on his deathbed, or a clandestine journey to France in disguise where he was knighted by a Frankish nobleman and learned courtesy. They wrote that he had visited the court of the King of France as a spy and been charmed by it. None of it was true, and all of it was necessary, because the alternative was to admit that the greatest chivalric virtues of the age had been most fully displayed by a man outside the faith. Dante, writing in the early 14th century, had to place him somewhere in the afterlife and could not bring himself to damn him properly. So Saladin appears in the first circle of the Inferno, in limbo among the virtuous pagans, with Homer and Aristotle and Julius Caesar, standing a little apart from the group alone. It is one line, and it is one of the highest compliments in the poem. Boccaccio put him in the Decameron as the hero of a parable about religious tolerance, in which the Sultan asks a Jewish moneylender which of the three faiths is true, hoping to trap him, and is answered with the story of the three identical rings, which no one can tell apart, and each of which the wearer believes is the original. The moral in a Christian book written for a Christian audience in the 14th century is that no one can prove which faith is the true one, and it is given to a Muslim king to appreciate the answer. Then in 1825, a Scottish novelist named Walter Scott published The Talisman and fixed the modern image permanently. His Saladin is a physician in disguise, wise, courteous, physically slight, morally superior to almost every Christian in the book. The contrast with the coarse and quarrelsome crusaders is the entire point. The famous scene, invented whole, has Richard demonstrating his strength by cleaving an iron bar with a broadsword, and Saladin answering by tossing a silk cushion into the air and cutting it in two with a scimitar so fine that the cut is invisible until the pieces fall apart. It is a perfect image of two kinds of power, and it never happened, and it has been in every retelling since. By then the tomb in Damascus had been largely forgotten. It was in poor repair, dusty, visited by few. And then, in 1898, the German Emperor Wilhelm II toured the Ottoman lands, came to Damascus, visited the grave, and made a speech declaring himself the friend of 300 million Muslims, and paid for a new marble sarcophagus and a bronze wreath to be placed on the old wooden one. It was a piece of pure imperial theater aimed at Britain and France, and its effect was to make Saladin news again. The wreath is no longer there. Lawrence of Arabia is said to have removed it during the First World War, and it turned up later in a museum in London. Which brings up the thing that is most often missed about the legend, and the most interesting part of it. For most of the 600 years after his death, Saladin was a bigger figure in Europe than he was in the Muslim world. In the Arabic historical tradition, he was respected, certainly, but he was one great ruler among many, and by no means the obvious first. The Crusades themselves, which loom so large in the Western imagination, were a regional and secondary matter in the long view of Islamic history compared with the Mongol catastrophe that came 60 years later and destroyed Baghdad, or the rise of the Ottomans, or the loss of Spain. The Arabic word that came to mean the Crusades as a distinct historical phenomenon, the Wars of the Cross, was not in common use until the 19th century. The Franks had been an irritating occupation on a strip of coast that had been dealt with and cleared. Nobody in Cairo in 1500 was brooding about it. What changed that was Europe returning. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as European empires took over most of the Muslim world, the Crusades were rediscovered as a template, and Saladin was rediscovered along with them, in large part because European writers had already made him famous, and their books were being translated. He became the necessary figure, the man who had united a fragmented Arab world, defeated a Western invasion, and taken back Jerusalem. The fact that he was a Kurd, not an Arab, was managed by different national traditions in different ways, and the fact that most of his career had been spent fighting other Muslims was managed by not mentioning it. The result is that today his name is used by everyone. Egyptian and Syrian and Iraqi leaders have claimed his mantle. His eagle is on national coats of arms in several countries. Kurdish nationalists point out, correctly and constantly, that he was one of them. Films have been made about him in half a dozen languages. He is invoked by people whose politics have nothing in common except a wish to borrow the authority of a man who has been dead for 8 centuries. He would probably have found it bewildering. His own idea of himself, so far as it can be recovered from the men who knew him, was much smaller and much more specific. So what was he actually like in the room? The eyewitness sources are unusually rich because he kept 2 educated men close to him for years who both wrote about it. Baha al-Din, his judge and chief of the army's legal affairs, wrote a biography full of small domestic detail. Imad al-Din, his chancellor, wrote a stylistically ornate account that is difficult to read and packed with information. Between them, and with the more critical view of the historian Ibn al-Athir, who served the rival house of Mosul and never entirely forgave Saladin for supplanting them, a fairly consistent person emerges. He was physically unimpressive. Short, slight, with a neat dark beard that went gray, and a face that people described as pleasant rather than commanding. He suffered all his life from recurring illness, colic and fever, and there were long periods in which he governed from a bed. He rode well and had no particular interest in the hunt, which, for a military aristocrat of that period, was faintly eccentric. He was, by every account, physically brave in a quiet way and enormously reluctant to be cruel. Executions of prisoners troubled him, and the sources record him going out of his way to avoid them, except in the 2 cases where he had made a public commitment, which were Reynold and the military orders after Hattin. He cried easily, in prayer, at poetry, at the death of friends, and at the sight of a bereaved family, and nobody in his world found this unmanly. He was hopeless with money, in a way that his officials treated as a chronic condition requiring management. He gave away plunder before it could be counted. He forgave debts. He handed out provinces to defeated enemies to make them allies, which sometimes worked brilliantly, and sometimes simply lost him a province. When his treasurers began hiding funds from him so that there would be something left for the army, he found out and did not mind. The 47 pieces of silver at the end were not an accident of bad luck. They were the last data point in a lifetime of consistent behavior. He was also, and this is the part the legend tends to smooth away, a highly effective politician who spent 12 years dismantling the family of his own patron and did so with a steady stream of pious justification. He fought far more Muslim armies than Christian ones. He broke oaths when it was necessary and kept them when it was useful, which is to say he behaved like a ruler. The historian from Mosul who disliked him accused him of using the Holy War as a cover for personal ambition, and the accusation is not stupid. The honest answer is probably that both things were true at once, that he believed what he said and also benefited enormously from believing it, and that this is the ordinary condition of successful people rather than a special hypocrisy, and he had an instinct for the gesture that ended a quarrel, which is rarer than military talent and worth more, sending an escort to bring his enemy's wife safely out of the city he was about to besiege, sending snow and fruit to a sick king who had massacred his garrison, releasing thousands of people who could not pay a ransom he had himself set, and doing it in a way that let his brother and his officers share the credit, refusing to seize the treasure of the patriarch because the letter of the agreement did not cover it. None of these decisions was strategically necessary. All of them were remembered on both sides for centuries, and together they did more for his position than any battle except one. He also, it should be said, could have been much crueler than he was, and would have been considered entirely within his rights. The standard of the age was the standard set in Jerusalem in 1099, and everyone knew it, and everyone expected it to be repeated in 1187. That it was not is the single reason his name traveled. There is a scene near the end of the Third Crusade that stays with most people who read the sources. It is winter in the hills near Jerusalem. The two armies have been in the field for years. Rain has been falling for days, the roads have turned to mud, the tents are rotting, the horses are dying of exposure and lack of fodder, and both sides are exhausted past the point of wanting anything except an end. Saladin's emirs have come to him and asked to be released for the season, and his secretary records his answer, that he could not sleep while any part of the country was in enemy hands, and that he would stay in the field as long as he had breath, and that they should go home if they must. He was in his 50s. He had a fever. He rode the lines in the rain to check the outposts himself, because he did not trust reports. That is closer to the real man than the silk cushion and the scimitar. Not the glittering courtier of the Western romances, and not the flawless liberator of the modern posters, but a tired, generous, chronically ill administrator with a talent for holding difficult men together, who spent 30 years in a saddle doing something he believed he had been placed on earth to do, and who died broke. To picture any of this properly, you have to know what an army of that world actually was, because it was nothing like the standing forces of later centuries. And understanding it explains most of Saladin's decisions. At the core stood the professional cavalry, and they were maintained by a system of land assignment. A commander was granted the revenue of a district, a group of villages, a stretch of irrigated land, and in exchange he was obliged to appear when summoned with a specified number of armed horsemen, equipped and fed at his own expense. He did not own the land. He held the income from it at the ruler's pleasure and could be moved to another district, which was the whole point, since a commander who put down roots became a rival. It made armies cheap for the treasury and expensive for everyone else, since the men who collected the revenue were also the men with the swords. The consequence was that a campaign had a season. Troops came in when summoned, usually in spring after the harvest was underway, served for a few months and expected to go home. Keeping them in the field through a second summer took extraordinary authority, and keeping them through a winter took either a crisis or a great deal of money. Saladin's ability to hold a coalition army together from 1187 to 1192, year after year, through rain and disease and boredom, was arguably a greater achievement than any battle he won, and it very nearly broke him. Their equipment was light by Frankish standards and much more mobile. A mail shirt, sometimes with lamella plates of hardened leather or iron laced over it, a conical helmet with a mail aventail, a small round shield, a straight or slightly curved sword, a mace, a lance, and above all a composite bow of wood and horn and sinew, short enough to be used from the saddle, which a trained man could shoot at a rate no crossbowman could match. The tactic that grew out of it was the one every crusader learned to dread: approach at speed, shoot, wheel away before contact, repeat until the enemy's horses are dead or his formation opens. Against that, the Frankish answer was armor and patience. The Western knight wore a long mail hauberk over padding, and by the end of the 12th century a great helm and a surcoat against the sun, and he was slow and hot and nearly unkillable by arrows at any distance. His horse was the vulnerable part, and both sides knew it. If he could be provoked into charging at the wrong moment, he would ride into empty ground and be surrounded. If he charged at the right moment, nothing on the field could stop him. Neither system could destroy the other. That is why, in a century of warfare in Syria and Palestine, there were only a handful of decisive open battles, and why the real substance of the war was castles. A siege in that country was a slow, technical, deeply unpleasant business. The attacker built stone-throwing engines. At first, the simple traction machines worked by teams of men hauling on ropes, and increasingly the counterweight engines that could throw a heavy stone with enough force to break masonry. He dug. Mining was the surest method. Drive a tunnel under a tower, prop the roof with timber, pack the gallery with brushwood and fat, set it alight, and the props burn through, and the tower comes down into the hole. The defender countermined, listening for the digging with basins of water on the ground, and when the two tunnels met, there was fighting in the dark underground, which everyone involved described as the worst thing they had ever done. Meanwhile, the garrison threw down fire. The naphtha compounds of the Syrian cities were the terror of the age, sticky, hard to extinguish, thrown in sealed pots or shot in tubes, and the Crusader siege towers at Acre were destroyed by them again and again. And around all this stood the ordinary reality of a medieval camp. Thousands of men and animals in one place for months. The smell, the flies, the dysentery, which killed more soldiers in every campaign than any weapon. The market that formed behind every army, with grain dealers and armorers and money changers and prostitutes. The volunteers who came to a holy war on both sides with no training and no equipment, scholars and shopkeepers and farmers, and who were often more fervent and less useful than anyone. The horse lines, the nightly noise of drums. Saladin lived in that world for 30 years, in a tent for most of it, and it is not surprising that his health failed early. The other half of his empire was the part that never fought, and it made the fighting possible. Egypt's wealth ran on two engines. The first was the flood. Every summer the Nile rose, fed by monsoon rain 1,000 miles to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, and the water spread across the valley and the delta and stood on the fields for weeks, and then drained away, leaving a layer of fresh silt. A good flood meant grain enough for the country and a surplus to sell. A low flood meant hunger, and 2 low floods in a row meant famine and riot. The state's entire budget was recalculated each year against the reading on the measuring column, and the surveyors went out afterward to reassess the fields, because the flood moved boundaries. The second engine was the spice road, and it worked like this. Ships from the Malabar coast of India and from further east crossed the Indian Ocean on the monsoon, unloaded at Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, and their cargoes were transferred to smaller vessels that worked north up a sea, notorious for reefs and contrary winds. They landed at ports on the Egyptian side, and camel caravans carried the goods across the desert to the Nile, and riverboats carried them down to Cairo and on to Alexandria. There the Italian merchants bought them. Pepper was the bulk of it. And pepper was not a luxury in the way later centuries imagined. It was a preservative, a medicine, and a mark of status, and Europe wanted more of it every year. With it came cinnamon and ginger, and cloves and nutmeg, indigo, cotton, aromatic woods, pearls, and Chinese ceramics. Going the other way went timber, iron, tin, weapons, wool cloth, and slaves from Eastern Europe. Every stage of that chain paid duty, and the duties funded the state. Which is why Saladin's brother conquered Yemen, why the Red Sea raid of Reynald of Chatillon was treated as an act of war rather than piracy, and why the Ayyubids protected Italian merchants in Alexandria with such care while fighting Italian sailors at Acre. It is also why, when a later dynasty in Cairo wanted to punish Europe, it could do so by simply raising the tariff, and why Portuguese navigators 2 centuries later would go to such lengths to find a way around Africa and cut Egypt out of the trade entirely, which eventually they did, and which eventually ruined it. Threaded through all of this was the pilgrimage, which in a good year moved tens of thousands of people across the same roads. Caravans assembled in Cairo and in Damascus each year and traveled south under escort, with water depots and wells maintained along the route by pious endowment, and the ruler who guaranteed their safety earned a prestige that no battle could buy. Saladin took that duty seriously and spent money on it. His successors did too. It was the quiet, unglamorous work of government, and it went on in the background of every war. Underneath the armies and the caravans lay the ordinary life of the country, which changed very little whoever was ruling, and which is worth pausing on, because it is the world almost everyone in this story actually lived in. A village in the Syrian interior was a cluster of flat-roofed houses of mud brick or rough stone, packed close along lanes barely wide enough for a loaded donkey, with the animals kept on the ground floor and the family above, warmed in winter by the heat of the beasts below. The roofs were used as rooms in their own right, for drying fruit and grain, for sleeping on in the summer when the houses held the heat, for sitting in the evening. Bread was baked in a communal oven, and the smell of it moving through the lanes at dawn was the first event of the day. The staples were bread, olives, olive oil, onions, lentils, chickpeas, yogurt and cheese, with fruit in season and meat rarely, at feasts and weddings, and after a slaughter. Sugar cane was grown in the coastal plain and in the Jordan Valley and processed in mills, and it was still expensive enough to be sold as a medicine. Water came from a well or a spring or a cistern cut into rock and filled by winter rain, and the fetching of it was the work of women and girls and the social event of the morning. In the cities the texture was denser. Streets were narrow and often roofed against the sun, so that a market lane was a tunnel of shade with bars of light falling through gaps. Trades clustered together by street, so the copper workers were all in one lane, and the sound of hammering came from that direction all day. And the dyers were in another lane, and the smell came from there. Every quarter had its mosque, its oven, its fountain, and its bathhouse. And the bathhouse was the social center of the neighborhood for both men and women at different hours. A sequence of rooms of rising heat, marble benches, steam, the sound of water in stone basins, and an hour of gossip afterward wrapped in towels. Houses turned inward. From the street a city house showed a blank wall and a plain door. And inside was a courtyard with a tree and a basin, and rooms opening off it, so that all the light and air and beauty of the building faced in toward the family, and none of it faced the world. The day was measured by the call to prayer from the minarets, 5 times, the first before dawn and the last after dark, and by the light. Most people rose before sunrise and went to bed not long after nightfall, because lamp oil cost money. Night in a medieval city was very dark and very quiet, with the gates of each quarter closed and a watchman walking, and the only people out were those with a reason. The year was measured by 2 calendars at once, which everyone found normal. The lunar Muslim calendar governed the fast month and the pilgrimage, and moved backward through the seasons by 11 days a year. The solar agricultural calendar, inherited from far older systems, governed the plowing and the harvest and the flood. Christians and Jews in the same towns kept their own reckonings on top of these, and the market simply absorbed all of it, so that a street might be quiet for one community's holy day and busy for another's in the same week. And through all of it ran the enormous, constant fact of travel. Caravans arriving, pilgrims passing, students walking from one city to another to hear a particular teacher, merchants who had been to India, soldiers from the steppe who spoke Turkish among themselves, Kurdish highlanders, Arab Bedouin, Armenian craftsmen, Greek doctors, Frankish captives, Nubian guards, Italian traders, The Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century was one of the most thoroughly mixed places on earth, and the wars that ran across it did not stop the mixing for a single year. It is worth spending a last hour in the cities themselves, because the war was the smaller part of what the Ayyubids left behind, and the buildings outlasted the dynasty by 8 centuries. Damascus under Saladin and his successors filled up with schools. The madrasa, the endowed college of law with residential rooms for students and a salaried professor and a fountain in a courtyard, had been rare in the city before Nur al-Din and was everywhere by the middle of the 13th century. There were dozens of them, tucked into the lanes near the great mosque, each one founded by a prince or an emir, or occasionally by a wealthy woman of the ruling family, each one endowed in perpetuity with the rent of a bakery, or a bathhouse, or a row of orchards. A student could arrive in Damascus from Andalusia or Khurasan with no money at all and be housed, fed, and taught for years. The endowments were legally untouchable, which meant that when governments fell, and they fell often, the schools kept paying. Beside the schools stood the hospitals. The one Nur al-Din founded in Damascus was still functioning as a teaching hospital 600 years later, and a visitor in the 14th century described patients arriving, being registered, having their clothes and money taken into safekeeping, being fed and treated at no cost, and being given a new set of clothes and a small sum of money on discharge so that they would not have to work immediately. Cairo grew in a different way, upward and outward from the citadel on the hill. The Fatimid palace quarter had been broken open and its treasures dispersed, and the walled royal city that ordinary Egyptians had never been allowed to enter became, over 2 generations, an ordinary commercial district full of shops. The markets spread. The sugar refineries along the canals worked through the season. The Nile flood was measured every summer at the gauge on the island, and the height of the water was cried through the streets because everything, taxes, prices, the year to come, followed from that number. Jerusalem after 1187 was rebuilt as a Muslim city, and, for the first time in a century, a mixed one. Saladin invited Jews to settle there again, who had been barred under Frankish rule, and communities came from Ascalon and from North Africa, and later from Europe. The Eastern Christian churches, Greek and Syriac and Armenian and Coptic, which had been subordinated under the Latin kingdom, got their properties and their standing back, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was closed for a few days, and then reopened for Christian worship under a compromise arrangement in which the keys were entrusted to 2 local Muslim families. Those families still hold them. The door of the most important church in Christendom has been opened each morning by the same 2 families for more than 800 years, which is the kind of small administrative decision that outlives every empire that surrounds it. The Aqsa Mosque was restored, and the great pulpit of Nur al-Din stood in it, and it stayed there for 782 years. In August 1969, a man set fire to the mosque. The blaze destroyed the southern end of the building and burned the pulpit almost completely. The cedar and the ebony and the ivory stars, the thousands of interlocking pieces fitted together without nails or glue by craftsmen in Aleppo before Saladin was even in Egypt. A few fragments survived. Decades later, a team of woodworkers and mathematicians reconstructed the geometry from old photographs and the surviving pieces, and a replica was built and installed in 2007, and the sermon is preached from it now. That, in a way, is the pattern of everything Saladin touched. Almost nothing survives in the original. Almost everything survives in some later form. Go and look for the physical traces today, and you find a scattered, unglamorous set of things. The citadel of Cairo is still there on its hill, though the Ottoman Mosque of Muhammad Ali that dominates it now was built 600 years after the walls, and the round Ayyubid towers of quarried pyramid stone crouch below it like an older animal under a newer one. The well is still there, cut 300 feet down through the rock, and you can walk down the spiral ramp where the oxen turned, in the dark with the air getting cooler. The castles the Crusaders built and Saladin fought for are mostly still standing because they were built to a standard that made demolition uneconomical. Kerak sits on its ridge above the desert road. The crack of the knights in Syria, which he looked at and decided not to besiege, is the finest medieval castle in the world and was still garrisoned in the 20th century. The Horns of Hattin are two low volcanic hills above a road, with dry grass and thistle and black stones and a view down to the lake. There is no monument. Sheep graze there. On a hot afternoon in July, the air over the plateau shimmers, and the water is visible the whole time, 6 or 7 miles away, and 1,000 feet below, close enough to see and much too far to reach. And in Damascus, in a small garden on the north side of the Umayyad Mosque, a few steps from the courtyard with its marble floor and its mosaic of green trees and golden rivers, there is a modest domed building with a green tiled roof. Inside are 2 cenotaphs. One is white marble, given by a German emperor with an agenda. The other is the original plain walnut, carved with an inscription, containing the bones of a man who once ruled from the Nile to the Tigris and who could not pay for his own grave. The city around it has been besieged, burned, occupied, and rebuilt more times than any historian has properly counted. The water still runs under the streets. The tomb is easy to miss, and that is where the story rests. The empire he built lasted 2 generations and was taken by the soldiers he had trained. The city he captured changed hands again and again for 800 more years and is contested still. The truce he signed ran for 3 years and 8 months. The reputation, which he never seems to have worked for very hard, has outlasted all of it, carried forward by the people he defeated, who could not stop telling stories about a man who was kinder than he needed to be. Somewhere on a dry plateau the grass is moving and the lake below is going gray with evening. The horses have been unsaddled. The tents are down. The road out of Tikrit closed behind a family in the dark a long time ago, and nobody remembers which gate it was. Let the names go quiet now. The armies have gone home, the treaties have expired, the fortresses are empty, and the wind moves through them without any particular hurry. Nothing more is required of you tonight. Rest now. Let it all settle. Sleep well, and good night.